What's up, guys? Welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you guys want to support the channel, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up, and you'll be supporting the channel whenever you do that. Additionally, you can become a patron. Not only is that the best way to support the channel, but additionally you'll get to vote weekly on a deck tech that I cover. Special shout out to my high contributing patrons, Newsom. You rock. Now let's get into today's deck tech with Kellan the Kid. And honestly, this was kind of a tough nut to crack because you can literally take it in any direction. As long as you're casting spells from anywhere other than your hand, the deck is just going to do what you want it to do. So again, with a lot of these open-ended commanders, it's kind of hard, or kind of, leaves a lot of options to the brewer of how they want to take this deck and the direction they want to take it, and you can kind of lose your way in building decks like that because they're so open-ended. But I think we finally landed in a place where I'm happy with the deck. Now, the overall goal of this deck is we're going to cast a lot of instant and sorcery spells, specifically that allow us to cast spells from our graveyard and spells that allow us to cast cards from our opponent's graveyard for free. We're also on a lot of Cipher cards because Cipher is really good with Kellan since it already does have evasion. So it's very easy for Kellan to attack. We get the Cipher. We actually cast the Cipher, so it's going to satisfy his ability, and then we get to put our cards into play. Now, again, the problem with these spell slinger strategies that want to end the game with your Dika Fractal Theorist effects are the fact that it's kind of hard to set up the board and cast all of your instant and sorcery spells at the same time, right? Dika's 5 mana. You don't want to be spending 5 mana and not casting instant and sorcery spells to further your game plan, right? Well, this deck kind of, breaks parity on that, because whenever we're casting our instant and sorcery spells from anywhere other than our hand, we actually get to just put those pieces directly into play. So now Dika, Shark Typhoon, all of those cards were just cheating directly into play instead of casting them, and that's kind of what this makes this deck viable in the first place. Now, there is a couple combos in this deck that do take a little bit to set up, but once you set them up, you're basically going to win the game. We have a way to cast our entire library, so if that sounds like a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. And again, I will make you guys that deal. If we get this video to 500 likes, I will go ahead and release a budget version, but without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing we're going to cover is how we're going to cast spells from anywhere other than our hand. The reality chip seems super good here. Instead of casting them from our hand, we'll just cast them from the top of our library. Not only is this pseudo card advantage, but again, we're doing exactly what the commander wants to do and generating a ton of value while doing it. One with the multiverse is way better, but you're going to pay for it. Now, this card's pretty cool here because it's going to allow us to cheat at least one spell per turn, whether it be from our hand or the top of our library. So it's pretty flexible there. Both of these cards pair amazingly with Sensei's Divining Top. It essentially turns Sensei's Divining Top into an exploration that we can just kind of use to rifle through our entire deck, right? All we have to do is put the top on top, we draw a card, then we cast the top from the top of our library, and that will allow us to put a land into play. So as long as we can keep putting lands into play with our commander, we can keep paying to put the top on top and to recast it. So it's going to essentially really rifle us through our deck extremely fast. It is probably worth noting that we can get rid of the CMC of the Sensei's Divining Top just because of how efficient some of the cards are in this deck at reducing the cost of spells that we are casting from anywhere other than our hand, like Savvy Trader or Sage of the Beyond. If we have any of these on the battlefield, Sensei's Divining Top will cost 0 from the top of our library, and it will kind of just allow us to draw our entire deck and put all of our lands into play. You're gonna win the game from there. Now, like I said, this kind of just came up out of the synergy we created in the deck. It does take 3 cards to go off, and we don't have any tutors to search for them, so it's a pretty fair combo, but it is very powerful if you get it off. Key to the Vault, really good here. It cheats mana cost, it allows us to cast something for free, and it's really easy to connect with Kellan. Now, Kellan is only 3 power, so that kind of sucks, but there are some bigger creatures in the deck that we can equip this to if we get them on the battlefield. Fibblethib, Lost on the Range, is also really good here. Now, this doesn't do the exact same thing as the other cards that allow us to cast spells from the top of our library, but plotting them can still be super powerful. It is going to let our opponents know what they're doing, but this card was basically built for this deck, so we're going to almost have to include it. Ethereal Valkyrie is honestly more of a flavor include. It is 6 CMC, so it's very expensive, but being able to foretell cards from our hand is going to synergize amazingly with the commander, so it's just going to work perfectly in the deck. Founding the third path is extremely underrated. Now that Farseek that you're casting on turn 2 is for free using Founding the third path, and then on turn 4, you can cast Farseek again to ramp even harder. Now, this does have read ahead, which really makes this card even better, because late game, we don't have to deal with the milling, we don't have to deal with casting the 1 or 2 CMC spells if we don't have them in our hand. We can just read ahead, exile the instant card we need to cast again, and instantly trigger our commander. Railway Brawler is going to be in this deck. That plot ability is broken, and we do have some pretty massive creatures in this deck that we will go over later. Alondo, this guy's really good in this deck. Now, he does take a little bit of setup, and he's kind of like a snowball-y option to this list, but you kind of want to exile your high CMC things, and then out of nowhere, once you have a couple high CMC things exiled, you start exiling your low CMC things, and that kind of just makes a snowbally turn where you cast everything for free all at once, and your commander's going to trigger a ton. He's kind of a perfect include in this deck, but does take a little bit of setup. Gaia's Will is one of those cards that can make a really explosive turn for us. Now, the thing is, though, we do kind of want to be casting this for free or using Alondo, right? There are a couple cards in the deck that do allow us to do this and just cast it outright, and then we get access to our graveyard and go off. Now, this is a very late game card, but a very useful card in its own right. From there, I wanted to talk about Cipher Cards, because again, this is kind of a perfect strategy for the deck. Cipher is not only going to give us the ability of the spell whenever we cast it, but it kind of just equips itself onto a creature, so then whenever you deal combat damage, you get to cast the copy of the spell. And since it's being cast, that does satisfy Kellan, and then we get to cheat our massive things into play. So even though stuff like Last Thoughts is 4 mana draw a card, it's really broken in Kellan when you get you get to cheat a 4 CMC permanent into play every turn consistently. And then again, even if you're just putting a land into play, you're essentially exploring every turn, which can be powerful in its own right. Stolen Identity is also really good. It's even higher CMC, which is actually a plus instead of a minus in this deck, since it allows us to cheat even higher CMC permanents into play. Additionally, something about this clone effect is you can actually target your opponent's things, which a lot of copy effects are limited to things you control. So this is going to be super flexible because of that. Arcane Heist is perfect in this deck. Not only does it have Cipher, again, perfect for our commander. Additionally, it allows us to steal our opponent's powerful instant and sorcery spells, and that kind of leads me into the next strategy of this deck. We kind of want to fill our opponent's graveyard with instant and sorceries. That way we can cast our instant and sorcery spells that steal their instant and sorcery spells. So Chaos Wand and Dazzling Sphinx are going to be perfect for this. Not only do these two cards steal our opponent's instant and sorcery spells, triggering our commander, that's going to put their instant and sorcery spells in their graveyard, allowing us to cast our spells like Arcane Heist and steal them again. This is kind of like the other strategy of the deck again, right? We're also on Flawless Forgery, more stealing, Spell Twine. This one steals something, but also you get something from your graveyard, which is really good. Notably, this is another spell that cheats the restriction on Gaia's Will's Suspend, so we can just cast it from our graveyard, steal one of our opponent's best spells, and then go off from our graveyard. Mnemonic Deluge can do some absolutely broken things in this deck. Now, we are on Alrund's Epiphany, but that is the only extra turn spell we're running, and honestly, we're only running it because it has amazing synergy with Kellan. I know that's kind of like he's running the extra turn spell because it synergizes with his commander, but honestly, it'd be kind of a crime not to. It's just perfect and a super fun card to run. I will say though, Mnemonic Betrayal copying Alrund's Epiphany 3 times is kind of disgusting and probably will just win you the game. But you can kind of say the same thing for anything Mnemonic Deluge is targeting, right? If you're casting this spell, you're going to target something worthwhile that probably does have the opportunity to win you the game. Quantum Misalignment is also pretty messed up in Kellan, right? Because we're going to cast it, now we have 2 Kellans, and then on our next turn when it casts itself from exile, we're going to get 2 Kellan triggers that will allow us to put a 5 CMC permanent into play, and then from then on, we're triggering Kellan 3 times every time we cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand. This card's going to do some really stupid things in this deck, and I'm excited to see what happens. Bramble Familiar is also going to be a welcome include here. Now, 9 times out of 10, he's just going to be a mana dork. But in the late game, when we want to get those broken instant and sorcery spells into our graveyard, he's perfect, and he's going to allow us to put more lands, enchantments, or creatures into play while we're doing it. Cosmic Intervention is super good here. We do commit a lot to the board because we're cheating a lot of permanents into play, so being able to protect them is super solid here. Echo of Eons is really cool tech here because whenever we cast it for its flashback cost, it's going to be 3 mana, right? But on the stack, it's going to see that that's a 6 mana spell, and we can cheat a 6 CMC permanent into play. Notably, we also do have that thing that allows us to cast our entire deck, so whenever you cast your entire deck, it's probably a smart idea to have a shuffler effect, just in case your win cons end up in your graveyard and you can't get them. Rod of Absorption, also perfect in this deck, just allowing us to cast all of those instant and sorcery spells that we've cast and our opponents have cast, and then cheat all of our permanents into play while doing that is just going to be pretty powerful here. Aminatu's Augury is extremely busted in this deck because it's going to trigger off of each thing we cast off of it. Not to mention, we do have a very good split of instant sorceries, enchantments, creatures, just because of the nature of this deck, right? It's split down the middle. Half of it's instant and sorceries, the other half are permanents. That way we can consistently trigger our commander and have something to cheat into play at the same time. We're also playing Behold the Multiverse, Ravenform, and Doomscar, just very flexible cards that are either removal or solid card advantage. Moving on to the core of the deck, let's talk about how we're going to generate a board state. Chrome Host Seed Shark, Shark Typhoon, Dika Fractal Theorist, all very good ways to generate a board state of very massive creatures. Let's think about resolving a Mnemonic Deluge here, right? Right off the bat, we're getting a 9 power creature, and then we're going to get 3 additional creatures off of whatever spell we copied. Let's say it's an Alron's Epiphany, that's going to be 3 additional 7/7s. That's going to be enough to end the game. Not to mention, Kellan does trigger on cast, so if we cast a Mnemonic Betrayal, we can cheat our Shark Typhoon into play, and then it will see every trigger. That's some busted synergy here. That's the top end, but the low end is just making a creature off of those Cipher Cards every turn very consistently. We're also running Felidar Retreat here. Now, the reason I chose this landfall trigger off of some of the other ones is because it does 2 things instead of 1. It can either buff our entire board state up if we already have a board state, or it can make us a board state. Now, notably, a lot of people overlook the fact that this gives our entire board state vigilance as well, so that can be very useful if we need to hold up our blockers while pressuring our opponent's life total. Shiraka is also going to be perfect in this deck. Not only is it a giant body, it generates a board state, additionally it's going to draw us cards and discard cards. The discarding cards is kind of powerful here because we can get those high CMC spells out of our hand in the early game, that way we can cheat them into play in the late game. Galadriel also seemed like a no-brainer here. Whenever we're putting creatures into play for free off of our commander, or we're generating a board state with Dika Fractal Theorist, Shirakai Genesis Engine, we're going to be triggering Galadriel, and she kind of does everything we need. She ramps us a ton, she can draw us more cards, or she just buffs our entire board state. Tatiova Benthic Druid and AC are going to be amazing here. Now we're drawing cards whenever we're putting those lands into play, and AC just allows us to play more lands. Archmage Emeritus, again, we copy a lot of spells in this deck because of our Arcane Heist effects, and that's just going to draw us a ton of cards here. Will Scion of Peace is kind of a sleeper in this deck, but it's very good. All we have to do is connect with Kellan and then tap Will, and we have a 3 CMC cost reduction on all of our blue and white spells, and that's going to be a total of 80% of the deck. Jace's Archivist is good here. It fills the graveyard, it draws us into a fresh new grip, and ensures that we always have something to put into play. Windfall does something very similar here. As long as we have a full grip, we can always be cheating something into play. We're also playing Smothering Tithe just because we're terrible people. Now whenever we activate our Jace's Archivist or Windfall, we get a ton of mana to spend, and that's just going to allow us to cast our massive spells like Mnemonic Betrayal, or just help us have that insane Gaia's Will turn where we cast everything from our graveyard. Frantic Search, again, pretty good here because it's going to get those high CMC spells out of our hand into our graveyard, and it's kind of mana neutral while drawing us into fresh cards. Mask of Memory, Mesmeric Orb, Pip-Boy, again, just solid ways to make sure that graveyard is constantly filling up. And remember, Mesmeric Orb's going to be super good here because we want our opponents to have instant and sorcery cards in their graveyard, that way we can steal them. Quandrix Apprentice, again, really good here because it's ensuring that we don't whiff on our commander and that we always have one land in our hand, that way we can cheat it into play. Seagate Restoration is extremely flexible here. It can be a giant spell that we cast off of Mnemonic Betrayal, or it can just be a land, whatever we need it to be at the time. Again, this deck took me a little bit longer than my normal builds to brew just because of how open-ended and how many directions you could take it, but again, I think we ended up with something pretty cohesive and pretty solid. I'm curious to see what you guys think about it in the comment section down below. With that being said, I want to thank my patrons, Creator, Newsome, Excessum, and Chicken Salad. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.